Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. Potter Stewart was a distinguished jurist who established a remarkable legal career, but is best known to most Americans, to the extent that he's known at all, as the author of the phrase about pornography, "I don't know what it is, but I know it when I see it." In this week's episode of Horns, our guests and panelists bring together a similar definition not regarding pornography, but regarding another powerful force, that of ideology. Professor Jeremy Surrey of the University of Texas Austin, who is a contributor to the volume, brings together a panel consisting of Christopher McKnight Nichols from Ohio State University, Raymond Haversky from Indiana University, and Emily Conroy Krutz from Michigan State University, talking about the volume Ideology in U.S. Foreign Relations, New Histories. A good deal of this conversation deals with the fascinating question of just what is ideology, and how does one trace its influence? Is it distinct from religion? Is it part of religion? Is religion a part of ideology? And how is it that this shapes the foreign relations of the United States? This is a fascinating discussion with both historical and contemporary relevance. Let's listen in.
It's so good to see such wonderful friends here on the screen. We have gone back to lots of live events, but it's also good that we can still use Zoom to bring in distinguished, wonderful scholars who are clearly too busy to be able to fly in to see us. This is really something we've learned to do better, I think, because of Zoom, certainly in our classes and in our discussions. And I want to thank our audience for coming back to Zoom for this event. I've been looking forward to this event for months and months. We're going to talk today about this fantastic new book that I hope everyone is going to pick up and read, Ideology in U.S. Foreign Relations. Some of you will have it assigned to you, so you won't even have a choice. But hopefully those who don't have it assigned will pick it up. I think it's really an important intervention in the way we think about foreign policy, both from a historical perspective, but also from a contemporary lens as well. And we're going to talk about both perspectives today. We have with us three of the distinguished authors from the volume, including one of the editors. Christopher McKnight Nichols is the Wayne Woodrow Hayes Chair in National Security Studies and a professor of history at Ohio State University. And he and David Milne were the two editors and chief conspirators behind this cabal that we produced here. Emily Conroy Krutz is an associate professor of history at Michigan State University. She's the author of Christian Imperialism, Converting the World in the Early American Republic, which is a wonderful book, certainly on all the comps lists that I have my students reading. I should have mentioned Chris Nichols' earlier book, Promise and Peril, America at the Dawn of a Global Age. And then we have Raymond Haversky. Ray is a professor of history, director of American Studies. And when I looked at the web page, Ray, you're like the director of 75 other programs, it seems, at Indiana University School of Liberal Arts. You have everything but president of the school next to your name.
Yes, that's coming.
Don't do it, Ray. Don't do it. Don't do it. Ray is an intellectual and religious historian, as well as a diplomatic historian. And his most recent book is a wonderful title. It's Only a Movie, Films and Critics in American Culture. So what we're going to do today is have just a few minutes from Chris Nichols as one of the editors on the project, how the project came together. And then we'll go to Emily, Ray, and Chris to say a little bit about their respective chapters. I might say a little bit about mine as well, but I'm mostly going to play the role of facilitator. We'll have a little discussion among ourselves, and then we will go right to Q&A. Please enter your questions, and I will try to make sure we get to all of them. We have a great group to answer questions in succinct, direct, thoughtful ways. So, Chris, let me turn it over to you.
Great. So thanks so much, Jeremy, for hosting us and moderating. Thanks to Emily and Ray for joining too, and for all three of you for your great contributions to the book, and to Elizabeth and everybody at the Clements Center and UT Austin for having us here remotely. So I'll just quickly sort of give us a little meat to chew on regarding the book, how we came to the project. It got these terrific authors and contributions, and some of what we hope to do. We can get to more when we talk about the specific chapters and your questions. So one of the core conceits of the book is that, in fact, ideologies and ideas matter to the shaping of U.S. foreign relations and foreign policy, despite the fact that many politicians, diplomats, citizens, commentators suggest at various moments historically and in the present that ideology isn't that important, or that in a hierarchy of causal factors that lead to policy outcomes or simply the worldviews that regular people have, including children, ideas aren't that significant. And that, in fact, material drivers, for instance, are more important. So what we wanted to do was bring together a whole lot of really smart folks, rising scholars, well-established scholars, people with different areas of expertise in different subfields, from race and religion, intellectual history, sort of more traditional foreign relations, immigration, and with different kind of vantage points, looking at different sorts of figures, perhaps outside of the mainstream, perhaps outside of normal policymaking channels, to get a sense of the broadest possible ways in which ideology shapes U.S. foreign relations, and then to ask some sort of critical questions of the contributors. So I'll be interested to see what you all think now, having come through this project over 3 or 4 years. But one question is sort of, what is ideology? And there's no clear consensus amongst the scholars contributing to this book, but there is a clear consensus that ideologies, sort of in the plural, operate in the world in terms of worldviews of individuals and therefore have shaping cultural and political effects on outcomes. But as some intellectual historians have argued over the years, it's a little bit like nailing jelly to the wall to discern what those are, because they're always evolving to some extent, right? So you don't have simple answers about what is ideology or what specific ideology is operating in a given moment. Jeremy, your chapter, Thinking About Freedom, does this well. There's 3 sort of orientations that you sketch out, and you describe them as evolving, sometimes, terminally and sometimes overlapping. And so hopefully you can talk a little bit about that too. But we ask questions about sort of what's the reality of constant U.S. military engagement? How is that formative for questions of ideology? How has war fundamentally shaped American ideologies from an era of the U.S. being fundamentally weak in the 18th and 19th centuries to an era of the U.S. having kind of hegemonic global power and global presumptions about the use of that power? So that's a background element of this. And I'd love to bring up some of the other main arguments and themes that emerged. But just to pick one that I think stands out, it stood out to me that I didn't think that we would necessarily find. Civilization is one of these shaping factors throughout the book that I didn't anticipate we would spend quite as much time on as we did. So another chapter in the book by Ben Coates deals with how presidents have used the rhetoric of civilization. And you see this over the sweep of US history and even the first chapter before the American Republic in thinking about civilization and subjecthood and who and what counts in a civilization and how you rank kind of individuals and groups and their capacities, and how that then had ideological sort of preconditions that shaped U.S. foreign relations even before the U.S. was a republic. So in its colonial era, who was understood to count and who wouldn't. So that's one element of this. And we still hear this today. You hear this in presidential rhetoric, and you hear it to some extent in how individuals think about the world they're embedded in and enmeshed in, and what kinds of outcomes they want for the future. So I'll leave it there with that, and hopefully we can get to some more as we go.
Great. A lovely aperitif to get us started there. And I do want to say for many of our listeners who have not taken on the task of editing a volume, don't do it. It's a lot of work. The outcome is fantastic, but all of us, I think, on this Zoom call, all of us have done this maybe too many times, and it's a really difficult task. We owe you and David Milne, Chris, we owe you a real debt of gratitude for the work you've done, not just conceptually, but also organizationally, to pull us together. On that note, I'm going to turn to Emily, who has a really lovely chapter in the book, and I want to read the title of it so I get it exactly right. Emily's chapter is For Young People: Protestant Missions, Geography, and American Youth at the End of the 19th Century. And I really loved, Emily, the way you brought together both the questions of youth and, of course, religious mission. So let me turn it over to you to talk about your chapter.
Okay, thanks so much. And thanks for reading the title. I just realized I had totally forgotten what my subtitle was. So I was about to scramble the table of contents to get it for everyone. So thanks so much. Chris and David brought together a really phenomenal group of folks to talk about these big questions. And I approached my essay. I'm a historian of religion and foreign relations. And so you can't get around the question of, to what extent, how and when and why does ideology shape action and things like that. And I've been puzzling over it in a lot of ways in my work, and had come across a series of sources that I really wanted to dig into a little bit more. And so that's what I focused on for this essay. And it's a series of articles designed for young readers. The column was called For Young People, started in the 1870s, sort of ran through the early 20th century in the major publication of one of the missionary organizations in the U.S., the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, or the ABCFM. It's a Congregationalist organization. And what I found really compelling about these pieces was, in part, they were just kind of fun. There's some really interesting artwork that you can really dig into. There was a, anthropomorphic boat that featured into a lot of the essays. And so that was a little different than the sources I usually worked with, but also to this question of ideology, looking at materials designed for children seemed like a really exciting way of thinking through that question. As Chris was saying, like, how does ideology change over time? How does it persist over time? And for these missionaries, it really matters that this framework will continue through the generations, because you need missionaries going forward, you need money going forward. And so here we saw the distillation of this kind of complex ideology, and sometimes kind of hard to get at issues that feature in literature that is, policymakers and adults are focusing on, kind of distilled for young readers in this way that they're hoping is going to work over time. And so, throughout the essay, what I did was started with thinking about, what is children's literature designed to do in this context. It's didactic, it's inspiring, it's supposed to be informing readers about the world and also calling them to take action in it. And like other missionary literature, those which are designed for children are claiming authority and claiming expertise over the world and its people. And so trying to shape this particular subgroup of American readers as people who can be knowledgeable about the world and have a very clear sense of what America's place in that world is and what their place in that world is. So there's two aspects of this ideology that I found as I was looking through juvenile literature, juvenile missionary literature, I should say. One is that there was an active evangelistic impulse throughout it, insisting on American Protestant Christians. They have the right and the duty to intervene in the world. But also there is this really interesting and complicated tension between a focus on racial hierarchy and also a belief in the ultimate equality of all souls. And we see this throughout missionary literature. It's something that historians of religion have long talked about in this 19th century, late 19th into early 20th century transition. How do you go, how do you move towards a more pluralistic outlook? How do you think about, the experience with actually kind of being out in the world in mission work over many generations? How does that change the way that American Christians think about peoples around the world? And so what we see in this literature is simultaneously the expression of racist ideology and also the beginnings of tools to challenge that racist ideology happening at the same time. And again, we see this, of course, in materials that are intended for adults, but it's distilled in a way for children that I found really helpful to start thinking through, because these are big questions that scholars have been thinking through for a long time. How does this change happen? When does this change happen, and why? So, focusing on children, the essay, I compare some work from the 1840s to some of this later work to kind of get at that shift in discussions of race in particular. And so we see in sort of earlier 19th century materials, the emphasis on writing for children is very much that you are lucky to have been born in the United States. This United States is a Christian land, and had you been born in sort of any of these other places where the United States is sending out missionaries to, here are the horrible things that you might have experienced. And it's very explicitly, frequently have, directly addressing young readers with kind of that kind of mode. And so what is your response as a young reader is that you have to, for one, be grateful that you are where you are and you're blessed with this country that you just happen to luck into being born into through the grace of God. And you also need to act in response to that. You need to donate to the mission cause. You need to potentially, in order to donate, you need to sort of refrain from certain kinds of luxuries in order to have, spare change to donate to the mission cause. And maybe you'll grow up to become a missionary. And so that is the theme early on. And it's, incredibly racialized language throughout, very hierarchical. What's really interesting is that in the 1870s, we start to see a shifting kind of language in the discussion to American children. And in part, it's, the racism is still there, for sure. The sort of sense that, one is lucky to have been born in the United States, the sense that one needs to act in gratitude and sort of action in the world to make the rest of the world look more like the United States, that is still there. But we start to see is also some language about kind of reflecting back on U.S. culture. And not only do these missionaries write about how strange the world is, but they also write about how strange the United States might seem to people elsewhere. And that's really key. One of my favorite examples of this has to do with one missionary in Osaka in the 1870s, writes about, he starts collecting idols. So he's going around convincing the Japanese, part of conversion to Christianity is that you're going to abandon your idols, from traditional practice, but you don't destroy them, because what you do is you give them to the missionary so that he can send them to Yale, where they can be studied by Yale students in the United States, because they are a symbol of sort of Japaneseness and of the sort of innate Japanese culture that Americans want to understand in this exact moment. And so there's illustrations that accompany this of sort of the idols that are coming back. And you can imagine these young readers imagining, when I grow up, I'm going to go to Yale and I can see those images that were abandoned. And it's this, it sort of spells out in, I think, much clearer ways than some of the material for adults, some of these complicated dynamics that are going on in late 19th century, sort of shifting ideas about cosmopolitanism, about pluralism, about, what role ought the United States to have in the world as a whole, right? Certainly within missionary literature, it's all about the U.S. should be a sending nation, of sort of sending out civilization, to use the term Chris was talking about, sending out sort of appropriate religious and cultural behavior, but also as a consumer in really interesting and complicated ways of things that are coming in as well. Yeah, so that's one quick example. I'll just very quickly, before I hand it over to Ray, sort of one other thing within there. There's a great example too about sort of one missionary writing for this column about how some of the Muslims that they work among, they reverence, but they do not obey the Quran. And then they go from there. That's sort of a criticism of these, the irreligiosity of these people they're talking about. And say also there are plenty of Americans who reverence the Bible but do not follow it, which is, of course, a criticism of American irreligiosity. And what's happening sort of here, right, is at the one hand, there's an equality of these two categories of people, right, both of whom are people who claim a faith they do not fully follow. But the implication too, right? So we can share a sense of some identity across those lines. But the dynamic within that also is that the Americans should be ashamed because they should be better than these other people, right? They are Christians. They should be, they're sort of held to this higher level. These articles as a whole argued that sort of Americans' role in the world was to intervene, to bring the good news of the gospel and of modernity in some ways. And so we see adult writers in this moment sort of holding to the same ideological framework, even as we see more pluralistic appreciation of foreign cultures and people sort of starting to come out. And hopefully that's a way of starting to think through, because of sort of the generational story here, the ways that some of these ideas will change over time, while holding on to some of those older resonances.
That was great, Emily. I think you gave us a lot of the key argument and the texture of the chapter, and your really fascinating research. There's a line you have right after, actually, the discussion of the Quran and after the discussion of Chinese. I just wanted to read this line because I liked it, and I get to read it since I liked it. So here, perhaps most directly, the writer's comparisons between American Protestantism and other religions were designed to prick at the conscience of young American readers. The comparison then could both create connections and also shame Americans for the likeness, and I think that's your point, right? That actually this is going into the consciousness of those who will be making decisions as citizens and as policymakers themselves about foreign policy, right? Great, Ray. Let's turn to you. Ray's chapter meditates on a topic I think all of us have meditated on one way or another, not as effectively as Ray has, the question of just war. And as we look out at Ukraine today, we're all asking ourselves, wonderful title for Ray's chapter, Just War as Ideology, a Militant Ecumenism of Catholics and Evangelicals. I'm glad you didn't have Jews on that. I would have felt I was including militant ecumenism there.
Yeah. Well, for another chapter. Actually, Emily, I have a question for you before we get too far down the road here. So one of the things that we both deal with is religion.
Yeah.
And can you tell, this is one thing I think I see in your work pretty consistently, including the address that you gave to Schaeffer, which was really outstanding, right? Congratulations on that. Yeah. What is the difference between religion or the idea of being religious and ideology and being ideological?
I was counting on you to answer that question.
Yeah, I wrestled with this, but I think that you have been working through this for a while in one way or another, but do you have a way to describe it to students or to readers that is like a shorthand for you? Because that is something that I really do wrestle with a bit, especially in this chapter. But
yeah, I know. I think we both did. And one of the things when the edits that Chris and David sent me, I don't know about you, but I got the, you need to be more explicit
about what ideology
tell
is.
us what ideology is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I'm still working through that question. I've got a piece that's on my, that I need to be making more progress on this as well.
Good.
And how do we, in foreign relations in particular, think through, what is, I think, I understand, religion to be a subset of ideology here. Like it's a kind of where, if ideology is a broad framework that helps to sort of structure sort of understandings about how someone thinks the world does and should work, and how they ought to act in it, that religion is, part of what religion is a kind of ideology.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't check the participants list too much to see if we have any religious studies people there, because who would, I'm sure, encourage us to talk about the way that religion is also about practice and material life as well. But I think the where it shows up in my work and sort of where it frames my understanding of ideology is that it's sort of both describe a way of looking at the world and understanding sort of who are you, who is everyone else, and how ought you to act in it. A framing thing. Is that how you think about it as well?
Well, no, and I think we're religious studies people have been arguing what is religion for, I would say, about a decade, right? And I think they've been breaking up into camps, and one of those camps is that it's an ideology, it's a systematic way of thinking, and it's and the material existence of a practice or of a congregation is almost beside the point. That when you enter into that place or into those ceremonies, you've already given up your ability to think outside of the box that you are the intellectual box that you're entering. Which I think is interesting to some extent. And it's definitely played out in the folks that I was looking at in my chapter a bit, because it was, a division within Christianity or even within Catholicism.
And so I'll be interested to hear you talk more about this, right? Because I was actually just teaching the Smith article, Religions, Religious, or whatever that was, this past week, and talking with my grad students about, what is religion and how do we apply it? This is for a class on religion and empire I'm teaching right now. And it was remarkable how quickly sort of around the room, because there's a few students who study the US, a few who study Japan, someone who works on Africa, and depending on which religion and which region of the world people are talking in, they had, came very differently down on, belief, ritual, something else. And so within US Christian stuff, right, there's often a division between sort of discussions of Catholicism and Protestantism in terms of how central belief versus ritual is. And so, so my question for you, I guess, there is, right, how much, as you're sort of studying those two groups working together, do you see a different understanding of ideology?
And this is where I think they made common cause, like the conservative Catholics and conservative Protestants made common cause, not so much, not at all theologically, but ideologically, and that just war was convenient language. And so, when I did my chapter is about how just war is useful as a language, as a way to moralize American foreign policy or military policy. But it also, I think, this is something that Chris and David certainly helped me bring out, is that it was also a way to distract the conversation from the material of history, which was who is killing who. Who is controlling the fate of which population around the world. So the idea, like the language of just war, the remoralization of American military policy through a focus on whether or not the United States was a just power or if it had conflicts that could fit underneath the rubric of just war, then allowed things to happen, right? Central America and parts of Southeast Asia that just fit under the umbrella that in the long run it would be okay, right? Bad things will happen, yes, but ultimately this is a good place, and because it's a good country, the arc of history, will prove America right. So to talk a bit about my chapter, my subjects were again conservative Catholics who, in this case, is represented by George Weigel, who has become a rather important intellectual, I'd say, on the right. He has run a couple of centers in DC for decades, and he made common cause through Richard John Newhouse, who became sort of a major figure in the 1980s and 1990s. Even became an advisor to George W. Bush in the 2000s, who tried to create this ecumenical connection between conservative Catholics and very powerful evangelical Protestants. Newhouse himself was a Lutheran pastor who, like many of these guys, actually started on the left in the 1960s, was very critical of the Vietnam War, but not critical of the United States. And after the Vietnam War, believed that the United States had an opportunity to either learn the lesson of Vietnam, whatever that was, and lead the world in a new way, or go the way of the left, which was to criticize the United States into oblivion and to find no center of gravity theologically, intellectually, ideologically. And so George Weigel was sort of a convenient person, I think, for Newhouse to sort of gravitate towards, because Weigel was talking about a tradition that existed far longer than the United States, far longer than democracy, this idea that the Catholic Church was a sort of bedrock of the moral understanding of what it meant to be human and what it meant to order a society in the right way. And this is really something that after the Vietnam War, not surprisingly, all groups on all sides of the political spectrum were looking for. The question was, who's going to win out? And into the 1980s, as Reagan gets elected, the winds from the right are growing stronger and stronger. And up to that point, the left had been a tremendous critic of how the United States got into Vietnam, how the Cold War had gone sort of off the rails, how Reagan had been elected and things like that, but had not offered, according to this group on the right, any alternative to what Vietnam had created. And so Newhouse saw a vacuum and filled it. So he enters into the fray with Weigel and other sort of very powerful evangelical groups, evangelical Protestant groups. And the one source of opposition to them were Catholic bishops, which was really rather stunning because they had written a critique of American foreign policy and in particular Reagan's military policy with nuclear weapons. It's called The Challenge of Peace. It came out in 1983. It was an encyclical or a piece, what they called it, Peace Pastoral, that came out from the bishops themselves. And it was the launching point for this great debate over just war and how America fit into that tradition. Because that was what Weigel is arguing, that it wasn't that just war fit into America's history. It was that the United States fit into just war, the just war tradition. And this was the strange attractor, in a way, for Protestants and Catholics on the right to gravitate towards each other and to meet the bishops sort of on their own terrain and to argue once and for all what type of society was the United States promising to be. And there was a clear choice. The bishops were either going to say they were not on the side of the history of the United States, or they were going to line up on the other side with conservatives, that they should be on the side of the United States as being a force for good in the world and figure out a way how to reform the country as best they could. And just war was going to be one of the central ways to figure out American foreign policy, American military policy going forward. So it was a very fun thing to write because it's this little window into a much larger debate about how Americans kill and die for their country, and how that forces people to sort of line up around an issue that can be, I don't think there are many issues that are more consequential to a nation than how we ask people to kill and die for it. So yeah, that was my chapter.
And Ray, I think you do a really nice job of one of the central tenets of ideological exploration as a historian is how the same ideas, the same things, the same facts can be interpreted differently. And you show that in this debate. I love the line you have when you're talking about Weigel. Weigel sought to remoralize American foreign policy by deploying a novel interpretation of just war theory. Working with the NAE, Weigel intended to use just war not really to make a case for American power, but against, and this is what you were just referring to, against an increasingly robust anti-nuclear movement. And we often forget the early 1980s, thanks to the Catholic bishops and others, nuclear freeze referenda were winning in multiple states. And so the stakes were pretty large in this debate over religion and just war, right?
Absolutely. And we forget, again, obviously for historians, they don't forget this, but I think my students have forgotten just how serious the ideological challenge was from the Soviet Union, right? I mean, Gorbachev died the other day, and I was saying to one of my colleagues, I'm probably one of the few people who cried over that, just because of the emotional investment I have had as a historian in the Cold War of Gorbachev and his legacy, how important he was in so many ways. The tension, we forget the immense amount of tension that he brought with him into debates with Reagan, into negotiations with the United States. It's really an extraordinary, figure.
Absolutely.
In history. So anyway, yes, I think that this is, and Weigel believed that these were the terms that the bishops had not fully absorbed, even though I think they would argue from the other side, which they did. But yeah, it's that kind of, the stakes were so crucial to guys like Weigel. And he, in some ways, he won.
Yeah. And in a sense, there's an ideological debate going on in the Soviet Union at the same time. There's
absolutely right.
You opened the door, Ray. Our podcast episode 207 last week, This is Democracy, is all about this. Many of you, I'm sure, have heard our discussion with Bill Taubman about Gorbachev, and it's
great.
Zachary's discussion. So everyone can listen to that and just follow up on our conversation.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. It was great.
Chris, your chapter brings out another forgotten strand, at least forgotten for many non-historians, in thinking about American foreign policy and the role of ideology, unilateralism as ideology. Let me turn it over to you, Chris.
Yeah, and I'll keep this one brief because we've already got a lot of meat here to discuss, and I'm eager to hear what the audience has to say. But I start with the chapter with the sort of debates of the last two presidential administrations, and the kind of sense that the Trump administration heralded something radically new in terms of its unilateralism, withdrawing from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, from the Iran Accord, being skeptical of NATO, and we could make a long list for the whole rest of our time together. But in fact, my argument is that unilateralism may be the longest, deepest strand of foreign policy ideology in U.S. foreign relations, and that it has had a sort of sinuous, sometimes subterranean path to the present, but that you see it very often rearing its potentially ugly head, and at other times potentially very useful head in helping orient policymakers and citizens to how the nation ought to act in the world. And that one of the peculiar things about unilateralism, which is like ideology in U.S. foreign relations, is that there's a sort of pernicious lack of self-awareness about it. And that's what we saw in these debates, in the Obama administration, in the Trump administration, and now in the Biden administration. And what I tracked, which fit neatly right as we were putting the book to press, was this back and forth in the Biden administration between some commentators thinking that America was back, right, into multilateralism, rejecting what came before, and others seeing a whole lot of unilateralism, the withdrawal from Afghanistan being the sort of archetypal move, which seemed very much consistent with what had come before. But I don't spend a lot of time in the chapter with the most recent history. In fact, I mostly turn it back to the more distant past and trace these origins in the 18th and 19th century to give us a sense of this as a firm kind of bedrock, a unilateralism, an orientation to the world for the U.S. to act on its own, in its own best interests, which really deflects back to your chapter, Ray's, and Emily's in some ways. If you think about the core assumptions that guiding how young people were supposed to learn about the missionary impulses in the world, there's this exceptionalism. There certainly is and I'll be interested to know if Emily thinks this is different, but my reading of her interpretation is that the U.S. is acting on its own in the world. Fellow believers may be acting in concert with others, trying to proselytize the world, but this is very unidirectional. This is not multi-directional. And though there are international organizations, tons of them guiding mission movements, say transatlantically and around the world, again, the U.S. folks seem to think of this as a peculiar American mission. Same with the just war sort of thing that we're seeing there and how Ray was describing it, a kind of unilateral impulse for the U.S. to wage and win just wars. That's why Weigel becomes, an advisor to Bush, right? It's this thinking after 9/11 that sure, there should be allies or a coalition of the willing, but at the end of the day, it's the U.S. acting in the world. And what's interesting is when you go farther back, even when the U.S. didn't have the capacity to do quite as much, from policymakers as well as citizens, there was still this kind of impulse. And so I tracked that through some of the political rhetoric, and it's sort of a brief, winding intellectual genealogy of these ideas, hoping to provoke people to think a little bit more about this. It's definitely not the end-all, be-all of thinking about that. And I would add also some of the other chapters. Penny Von Eschen's chapter talks about unilateralism and neoliberalism going together, right, in the wake of the Cold War, and that fundamentally informing the kinds of policy options for the U.S. and for the world, because even as the U.S. is espousing a new world order, a George Bushian world order, where the U.S. would be a leader of a multilateral coalition, at the same time, it's very much on the U.S.'s own terms, even after the Cold War. So there was this moment for other possibilities. She argues, in fact, it's foreclosed, and I would argue, out of this kind of unilateralist ideological milieu.
Great, Chris. That captures so much, and I like how you really connected to some of the other chapters. I'm going to use the opportunity I have to say a tiny bit about my chapter, but really to make a historiographical point. After listening to these three, I think, stunning presentations of really rich pieces, and there's so many rich pieces in this volume, I want to say something about why I think this matters, why we should care. Why should we care? And I think the clearest reason why we should care is because this volume represents a different way of thinking about ideology and foreign policy. The chapters don't all agree 100%. They shouldn't. But they bring a different approach, not an approach that was necessarily pioneered by this volume, but that I think captures the ways in which our scholarly and informed discourse about foreign policy has changed in the last 10 to 15 years. So in a certain way, this volume becomes a primary document for the zeitgeist of the way we think about these issues. And I just want to sketch this out briefly. I think this will be interesting to some of our listeners, and feel free to disagree with me if any of you if you do. Ideology's always been. And always here means since World War II, has always been and at the center of the way Americans have written about their own foreign policy. All right, Americans have written about their foreign policy in ways that are always critiquing or imbricating ideology one way or another. William Appleman Williams and the New Left school of the late 50s and 1960s talks about the ideology of an open door. It's an ideology about economics. So it's not really about whether the United States makes money by opening markets. It's that we believe we make money by opening markets. And we believe that by doing this, it makes us better. And this becomes the explanation for American expansion, in Williams' case, going back to the 19th century, and others date it wherever they wish. So that underpins a lot of how people talk about ideology as scholars of foreign policy in the 60s and in the 70s. And you really can't pick up a discussion of Vietnam at that period without a discussion of some perception of what the United States is going to get out of this. The book that really preceded this and doing something similar that we all refer to one way or another, Michael Hunt's book from 1986, also on ideology and U.S. foreign policy, moves in a different direction, moves from a political economy ideology to an ideology that's anthropological. It's Geertz. He begins and ends with Clifford Geertz, which everyone was reading at that time, right? We were just undergrads then, but everyone was reading it who was beyond an undergrad. Actually, I was in high school then. And Geertz's anthropological argument was that it was the thick description, it was the experience of being in a different setting and interacting with others that set certain ideological frames for the way we thought about the world. And that's exactly what Michael Hunt does. He talks about why there's an American aversion to revolution, even though we revere our own revolution because of our particular experience. Our thick description of revolution makes other revolutions seem illegitimate. Our thick description of racial hierarchies makes other racial experiences and identities seem alien to us. And that structures the way I think a lot of the thinking of ideology and foreign policy developed in the 80s and the 90s around these questions of othering. And Edward Said gets layered onto that, I think. What this volume does, it doesn't reject any of that. This is not, historiography is not about trashing your elders. Historiography, right, is about layering, right, and adding to this. And I think what this volume does, and I think it was evident in each of these three presentations, even though we didn't actually force ourselves to do this, it just became evident in the presentations, it's evident throughout, there's a very strong emphasis on language. This is a linguistic focus on ideology. That doesn't mean language to the exclusion of other things, but the words people use. Just think about the presentations you heard from Emily, from Ray, and from Chris. It's very much about the words in the columns, the words in the debate between the theologians, right? The words for Chris that are used to justify American power in different cases. The language frames the experience, frames the understanding to such a great extent. I think we've become more attentive to the language that's used, and not just the language of the people at the top of the pyramid, but those infusing it in many different levels. And this is, for better or worse, the influence of Foucault and other scholars who have reminded us that the discursive structures we use matter enormously. Who could live through Trump's America and not think that? Who could deny that today in the world of Twitter, right? Who could deny that language and a few characters make such a difference in the way? I mean, look at how our news cycle is driven by that today. And so I think this volume speaks to that. And I'll just say a few sentences about my chapter, because it's certainly what also motivated my chapter. I think it's what we were all struggling with when we met in Oregon years and years ago, it seems. And it's what we still struggle with today. But in my chapter, I try to talk about the ways in which the language of freedom has changed, even though the same word is used. Throughout American society in the 18th and 19th century, and in the book I have coming out in a month on sort of post-Civil War period, I think it's front and center. Freedom does not mean the ability to expand somewhere else. Freedom is actually freedom from. right? To use the distinction Isaiah Berlin draws, right? It's freedom from both sides, right? One side is arguing freedom from intervention in slavery, and the other side, Lincoln's whole argument is that slavery degrades the freedom of the North. That's his whole point, right? So it's a freedom from argument, and my new book argues that difference over freedom from actually produces long-standing divisions that bring us to today. But as American power grows, I think in the late 19th century, I think the opportunity to seek freedom to imply access to things, does not just markets, becomes a possibility. And again, this relates to the book I have coming out. It's very deeply ingrained in the way we think about dealing with troubles at home. Because if we're fighting over freedom from at home, but there is a freedom to that we can agree on, that provides a basis, perhaps, for bringing people together. And William Henry Seward is actually the first to try to do this, trying to diffuse conflict at home by finding expansionary opportunities abroad. That's exactly what Seward is trying to do. And he sets a model, in a sense, for much of what comes after. That's not conspiratorial, by the way. It's just the way we think about freedom. Our freedom grows at home, and our divisions at home become less significant. Our debates over freedom from what? When we all have access to more in a different setting. And then I think after World War II, we move into a place where freedom is less freedom from or freedom to, it's freedom over. This is really what preponderant power means. Not that I have to have everything, but I have to make sure no one else does. I have to make sure that those areas aren't part of the Soviet sphere. I'm not free if there's a possibility that the Soviets or the Chinese today could do X, Y, and Z. And this is now not in the chapter, but I've been thinking a lot about this. If we look at our contemporary debates about China, we'll have a lot of Clements Center events about this in coming weeks and months. Most of it is not over what the United States needs in Asia today. It's what we're fearful we will lose access to, and what losing access to that will mean for us. And I'm not diminishing that argument. It's a very significant argument. But it's less about ownership. It's much more about access, control, preponderance. And that's a freedom over. And so what I argue in my chapter is that we've slipped in our language using the same word. Just as I've argued before, we slipped in our language what we mean by executive power. We've slipped in our language. We use the same word, but we actually mean different things. And that's really problematic, because then it's hard to actually understand what we're doing. And I think one of the roles we play as historians is to actually be the elucidators of what our language means. And I think one of the real contributions of this volume, why I think it's such a good volume, especially for teaching, is because it actually asks students to do that, really to unpack what I think is the hidden ideology, not the explicit programs. I guess at least one party still has a platform when they have a convention, right? Not the programmatic ideology, but more what's hidden, what's behind the words. You know, when we say "Make America Great," or when we say "MAGA Republicans," or whatever labels we're using, what's actually hidden behind there, and elucidating that so we can see its effects, and then actually really debate it. I think that's crucial if we're thinking back to China, of the evolving relationship between the U.S. and China, because we use language that evokes a different period that has vested in it other experiences, but hides what we're really arguing over today. I think this volume is a model, and particularly the 3 chapters from Emily, Ray, and Chris are models of doing that kind of work as methodology, in addition to the substance, whether it's reading columns closely, in Emily's case, reading theological arguments in Ray's case, and in Chris's case, reading carefully into the discussions, the discourse among foreign policy experts that you do so well, Chris. So I think there's a lot that we can get out of this as a model.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.